Welcome back to another deep dive. I am so glad you could join us today because our mission for this session is to completely deconstruct the mechanics of mass persuasion.
Yeah, it's a huge topic.
It really is. And, when people think about how a dictatorship holds on to power, the image that usually comes to mind is incredibly physical.
Right, like the blunt instruments of state control.
Exactly. We picture secret police kicking down doors in the middle of the night, or informants lingering on every street corner, political prisons. Like, we just visualize the sheer, terrifying brute force of a totalitarian regime.
Which makes total sense, because the mechanics of physical terror leave the most obvious, undeniable marks on the historical record.
Right. But the stack of sources we are pouring over today, and these are historical texts and primary documents analyzing the Nazi propaganda machine of the 1930s and 40s, they reveal a totally different layer of control.
They really do.
And actually, before we get into it, I do want to quickly set the tone for you listening. We are obviously dealing with incredibly sensitive, dark historical material here regarding the Third Reich.
Yeah, very heavy stuff.
Right. So we are here strictly as impartial guides. We aren't endorsing any viewpoints or taking any sides. We are just objectively unpacking the historical data, the quotes, and the documented tactics provided in the text.
Exactly. Just trying to understand how a modern dictatorship attempted to monopolize public thought.
So, okay, let's unpack this. Looking at that data requires a pretty profound shift in how we understand power, doesn't it?
Oh, absolutely. The sources make it super clear that the regime didn't just want to terrorize people sitting inside their homes. They wanted to fundamentally rewire how those people perceived reality itself.
Wow.
Yeah, propaganda wasn't just treated as like a side project or a mere accessory to the police state. It was engineered to be a vital, load-bearing pillar of the entire government machine.
And to figure out how you even begin to build a psychological machine on that scale, we really have to look at the architect.
Joseph Goebbels.
Right. The texts give us a deeply unsettling profile of the man. He was born in 1897 in the Rhineland, and he was actually born with a clubbed foot.
Which is a really crucial detail.
Yeah, because of that, he was excused from military service during the First World War. And the historical consensus noted in our sources is that this physical limitation, especially within a culture that was, becoming increasingly obsessed with militaristic perfection, it fueled a massive inferiority complex.
Right, he always felt like he had to prove himself. And he was also an outlier among the upper echelon of the Nazi leadership in terms of his background.
How so?
Well, he wasn't a street brawler like a lot of the early members. He actually held a PhD in philosophy from the University of Heidelberg.
Wait, really? A PhD in philosophy?
Yeah, he was one of the few genuine intellectuals in that inner circle. And his political trajectory is fascinating, too, because he didn't start out as a Hitler loyalist.
Oh, I didn't realize that.
Yeah, he originally aligned himself with a much more radical, anti-capitalist faction of the party that was led by Gregor Strasser.
Okay.
But he possessed this very calculating instinct for power. So he broke away from Strasser and pledged absolute loyalty to Hitler in 1926.
Just following the power.
Exactly. And by March of 1933, he was appointed the Minister of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda.
Which is just a terrifying title.
Yeah.
And I was reading through the transcripts of his very first press conference in that role from the sources. There is a quote that literally just stopped me in my tracks.
Well, I know the exact one you're talking about.
It's chilling. He tells the gathered press, and I'm quoting here, "If the means achieves the end, the means is good. Whether it always satisfies stringent aesthetic criteria or not is immaterial."
Yeah, that just completely strips away any illusion of idealism.
It really does. He views truth through a purely utilitarian, deeply cynical lens.
Completely amoral.
In reading that quote, I found myself thinking, he doesn't sound like a politician from the 1930s. He sounds exactly like a deeply cynical, modern marketing executive.
Oh, that is a great analogy.
You know what I mean? Like the type of person who only cares about user acquisition, daily engagement metrics, market penetration.
Yeah.
The actual objective truth of the product they are selling is completely irrelevant to them, just as long as the user clicks the button.
Yeah, the visual of that is so stark. It's like this dark industrial machine.
Yeah.
Goebbels was really frighteningly ahead of his time in that regard.
So what were his key performance indicators to keep the corporate analogy going?
Well, the sources outline 3 specific aims that he established for his ministry. First, to continually glorify the regime and its leadership.
Okay, standard dictator stuff.
Right. Second, to aggressively spread the party ideology while totally censoring anything deemed unacceptable.
Mm.
And third, and this is the big one, to integrate the nation's incredibly diverse regional populations into one uniform, predictable mass.
Which, I mean, that's a logistical nightmare in the
A
1930s.
massive one. Goebbels was, an incredibly skilled orator, but he recognized a fundamental structural problem in Germany at the time. Traditional decentralized communication was his enemy.
Because you can't control it.
Exactly. If people are sitting in their local pubs debating politics or reading fiercely independent regional newspapers, you can never achieve that total ideological integration. The messaging is just too diluted.
So he needed a new delivery mechanism.
Yeah.
He needed a medium that bypassed reading entirely, bypassed regional loyalties, and bypassed that critical thought process that happens when you, like, sit down with a piece of text.
Straight into the brain.
Right. He needed something that injected the message directly into the private living rooms of the citizens, and he weaponized the cutting-edge technology of the era to do it, which was radio.
Right, because Goebbels and Hitler fundamentally believed in the superiority of the spoken word over the written word.
Interesting. Why is that?
Because the spoken word is immediate. It triggers an emotional, visceral reaction, and it doesn't afford the listeners the time to pause, reread, and critically analyze the argument like a book does.
That makes a lot of sense.
So upon taking power, Goebbels moved swiftly to bring all regional broadcasting under centralized state control. He created the Reich Radio Company.
And he purged it right away.
Immediately.
Yeah.
To ensure absolute ideological compliance, he fired roughly 13% of the entire staff on political and racial grounds right out of the gate.
Wow. But I'm looking at the data on radio ownership from the sources, and they hit a huge bottleneck early on.
The hardware issue.
Yeah. In 1932, less than a quarter of German households actually owned a radio receiver.
Only 25%.
Right. So you can have the most heavily censored, perfectly crafted broadcasting company in the world, but if 3/4 of the country physically cannot hear you, you can't rewire their reality.
So the state's solution was this unprecedented push for mass production. They heavily subsidized the creation of a cheap, standardized radio called the Volksempfänger.
The people's receiver.
Exactly.
And the engineering of this device is so insidious, the sources point out that it deliberately featured a very short-range receiver. It was built specifically so it couldn't pick up foreign stations.
Right, you couldn't hear anything outside the bubble.
And just in case a citizen somehow managed to, rig the antenna to get a signal from outside the country, listening to foreign broadcasts like the BBC was legally punishable by death.
Punishable by death. Just for listening to the radio.
Just wild. So the state floods the consumer market with these cheap, restricted devices. And by 1939, 70% of German homes had a radio.
Which was the highest national figure of radio ownership anywhere in the world at that time.
But they didn't even limit this audio assault to the private home, did they?
No, not at all. For the 30% who didn't own a receiver, the state installed massive loudspeakers in public spaces.
Oh, wow. Like
restaurants, cafes, factory floors, public offices.
Hmm?
And they actually created a new civic role called radio wardens.
Radio wardens. What did they do?
These were individuals appointed in neighborhoods and workplaces whose literal job was to coordinate collective listening sessions whenever important broadcasts were aired.
You're kidding.
Nope. They would monitor attendance and gauge the crowd's reaction.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me, trying to wrap my head around the lived daily experience of that level of audio saturation.
It's hard to imagine.
The closest analogy I can think of is like being handed a modern smartphone, but the phone only has one single app.
Right.
You cannot delete the app, you cannot turn the volume down, and it just blares the exact same podcast 24 hours a day.
That sounds like a nightmare.
It does. And if you throw the phone away and walk outside to escape it, the same audio is playing on loudspeakers strapped to the street lamps.
Yeah, there's no escape.
So my question is, if you physically couldn't escape the sound in public or private, how did that constant, unrelenting repetition actually rewire people's understanding of reality?
Well, the sources actually provide a really chilling visual aid that answers that.
Yeah.
There's an analysis of a propaganda poster. It's listed as source 7 in the text.
Oh, yeah, the crowd poster.
Exactly.
Okay.
The artwork depicts this massive, densely packed crowd of citizens, and they're all bathed in this almost holy, glowing light that's emanating from an oversized people's radio.
Right.
And the text written across the poster simply reads, "All Germany hears the Führer." That illustrates the psychological mechanism at play. It is all about manufacturing consensus.
Manufacturing consensus. So if the only voices you ever hear are Nazi voices,
And everyone around you is hearing the exact same voices.
then the repetition eventually establishes the regime's narratives as inescapable daily facts.
Exactly. It just becomes the water you swim in.
And the sources detail how they use this manufactured consensus to normalize some truly horrific things. Like, they used it to constantly broadcast the justification for aggressive military expansion into Eastern Europe.
Yeah.
They used it to drill in the foundational pseudoscientific lies about the supposed inferiority of Jewish people.
Because when a lie is repeated on the radio in your kitchen and then echoed by the loudspeaker at your factory job, and then confirmed by the radio warden on your street.
The sheer volume of repetition just exhausts your cognitive defenses.
Right. The text actually includes a quote from Albert Speer, who was a high-ranking official during his Nuremberg trial testimony.
What did he say?
He stated that this was the first dictatorship in history to make complete use of technical means to deprive 80 million people of independent thought.
Depriving 80 million people of independent thought. Wow. But doing that requires a multi-front war on information, right? Because while the radio handled the spoken propaganda, Goebbels still had to deal with the written word.
Oh, absolutely. He had to muzzle the traditional media landscape, censor the written press, and completely curate the broader cultural sphere.
And the scale of that task in 1933 is staggering. The sources note there were over 4,700 daily newspapers operating in Germany at the time.
Over 4,700, that's huge.
Yeah. Because Germany had only been formally unified in 1871, the press was deeply regional. These papers were fiercely independent, privately owned, and catered to specific religious groups, local identities, or varied political parties.
So to dismantle that independence, the state employed a dual strategy of financial buyout and structural bottlenecking.
Okay, how did that work?
Well, the central Nazi publishing house, the Ager Verlag, systematically began buying up independent papers. By 1939, they controlled 2/3 of the entire German press.
2/3?
Yeah. And concurrently, they merged all the disparate news agencies into one massive state-controlled agency called the DNB.
Got it. So that ensures the raw news material is vetted and sanitized by the state before it even reaches a journalist's desk. But wait, buying 2/3 of the papers still leaves a third of them semi-independent? So how did they handle the rest?
The tactic that finally broke the back of the press was the editor's law, which passed in October 1933.
Right. This is crazy.
Yeah, this law legally mandated that newspaper content was the sole personal responsibility of the editor.
The brilliance of that legislation from like a totalitarian perspective is how it shifts the burden of enforcement.
Right.
It's like a modern government passing a law that says the CEO of a social media platform is going personally to prison if a random user posts a dissenting opinion.
Exactly.
If you make the platform legally liable for the content, the platform will heavily over-censor itself just to avoid the risk.
And that's exactly what happened. Goebbels didn't need to hire thousands of government censors to read every single article. He just turned the editors into their own prison guards.
Wow.
The historian quoted in the text summarizes it perfectly. He says there was no need for state censorship because the editor's most important function became that of the censor.
The fear of personal ruin was just incredibly effective.
Oh, incredibly. Even globally respected, highly independent papers, like the Frankfurter Zeitung, were ultimately squeezed until they were forced to close their doors in 1943.
And this curation extended far beyond just the news, right?
Yeah. The sources document massive cultural purges.
Right, like in May 1933, Goebbels orchestrated those high-profile public book burnings, mostly carried out by radicalized university students, destroying anything deemed intellectually unacceptable.
And the visual arts were strictly confined to heroic Aryan themes.
Jazz music was entirely banned, too.
Yeah, because the regime labeled it as quote-unquote black music, and their racial ideology deemed black people inferior.
Cinema was rigidly controlled as well. Goebbels heavily censored imported foreign films, and every domestic film had to carry an underlying pro-Nazi message.
But stifling the culture to that extreme degree produced a very specific unintended consequence for the regime.
Yes, and I'm so glad the sources bring this up.
Me too.
Because we often get this myth of total Nazi invincibility, you know? The idea that every citizen was just marching in perfect, brainwashed lockstep.
Right, like everyone was under a spell.
Exactly. But the text notes that before 1939, newspaper circulation actually fell by 10%.
10% drop.
Yeah. People stopped buying them because the writing had become so incredibly sterile, repetitive, and bland.
It was boring.
Just super boring. Furthermore, the sources mention a trend where Germans intentionally started arriving late to the cinema.
Oh, this is fascinating.
They would literally wait in the lobby just to avoid watching the mandatory, self-adulating pro-Nazi newsreels that played before the feature film.
This hiding in the lobby.
Right. So I look at those two beta points, dropping newspaper sales and hiding from newsreels, and I have to ask, wait a second, was the propaganda actually failing on some level?
It's a great question.
Like, people weren't completely brainwashed, they were just getting really bored.
Well, what's fascinating here is that you are identifying a crucial paradox of totalitarian systems. Total, suffocating control inevitably spawns deep apathy.
Yeah, because there's no variety.
Right. When every single piece of art, news, and entertainment is reduced to a clumsy vehicle for state praise, it completely loses its psychological
Yeah,
impact.
it just becomes noise.
Exactly. The text actually provides a remarkably insightful excerpt from the diary of Victor Klemperer, who was a Jewish academic living in Germany at the time.
What did he write?
So on August 8th, 1937, he wrote about the bitterness of the Third Reich's self-adulation and triumphalism.
Okay.
He observed how Goebbels was constantly, obsessively boasting, claiming Germany had the biggest lecture theater in the world, the biggest Autobahn in the world.
Always the biggest and best.
Right. And Klemperer recognized this desperate boasting for what it was, calling it the biggest lie in the world.
So the regime is sitting there, and they're realizing that passive consumption is losing its edge. The public is tuning out the bland newspapers and ignoring the preachy newsreels.
Yeah, the boredom is setting in.
And if you are a dictator, you cannot allow boredom to take root, because boredom eventually curdles into resentment, and resentment breeds rebellion.
Exactly. They needed a mechanism to force the public to stay actively engaged.
So what did they do?
They pivoted from passive media consumption to manufacturing active social rituals. They fundamentally rewrote the civic calendar.
And the sources outline how the most mundane, everyday interactions became intensely politicized.
Oh, entirely. You could no longer simply greet your neighbor with a good morning.
Right. That was replaced by the mandatory Heil Hitler greeting and the physical Nazi salute.
And the aesthetic of the nation changed, too, as militaristic uniforms became ubiquitous in civilian life.
They even elevated the Horst Wessel song, which was an anthem named after a young stormtrooper killed in 1930, to the status of like an alternative national anthem.
Yeah. They systematically hijacked the calendar to enforce collective physical participation. They established this relentless series of mandatory public festivals.
The list of these holidays in the text is just wild. You have January 30th marking the seizure of power.
Right.
April 20th becomes a massive celebration for Hitler's birthday. November 9th is set aside to commemorate the failed 1923 Munich Putsch.
They even attempted to phase out traditional Christmas celebrations.
Wait, really? Christmas?
Yeah, they tried to replace it with a pagan winter solstice festival.
Wow. So what does this all mean? When I look at all of these tactics combined, it looks identical to the mechanics used by fringe cults, just applied to an entire nation-state.
Oh, it absolutely is. The psychological mechanism beneath these rituals is deeply manipulative. It weaponizes cognitive dissonance.
Cognitive dissonance? How so?
Well, if a citizen secretly disagrees with the regime, but they are forced to physically raise their arm and say, "Hail Hitler" 10 times a day just to buy groceries or go to work, the brain experiences immense friction.
Because your actions don't match your beliefs.
Exactly. And over time, to relieve that internal psychological stress, the mind will often slowly align its beliefs with the physical actions the body is being forced to perform.
Wow. So by replacing something as fundamental as saying hello or celebrating Christmas, the state forces you to physically perform your loyalty every single day.
Yes.
And it completely obliterates the line between private life and public duty. If the state declares a new solstice festival, opting out is no longer just a matter of wanting to stay home and be introverted.
Exactly the opposite. If you refuse to use the greeting or you fail to fly the flag on Hitler's birthday, you aren't just being antisocial. You're committing a highly visible act of political defiance.
The ritual forces the citizen into daily complicity.
Exactly.
Which brings us to the ultimate question we have to answer when looking at these historical sources.
Right, the big one.
The regime poured unfathomable resources into mass-producing radios, legally terrifying editors into submission, and entirely rewriting the calendar. So did this massive, sophisticated machine actually work?
Well, the historiography, the way historians have viewed this over the decades has actually shifted significantly.
Oh, really? How so?
The sources detail how early post-war historians, like Robert Hertzstein, who published The War That Hitler Won in the 1970s, generally concluded that the propaganda was a massive, unqualified success
Interesting. Why did they think that?
because they analyzed the sheer, overwhelming volume of output. The endless rallies, the millions of radios, the ubiquitous posters. They basically equated total output with total psychological control.
Okay, that makes sense on the surface. But the text states that more recent historical research tells a different story.
A very different story.
Yeah, studies focusing on the oral history and diaries of average citizens paint a much more complicated picture. The propaganda was, in reality, only partially effective.
Right. It achieved undeniable successes in specific areas, but it also suffered glaring systemic failures.
Okay, let's start with the successes. What actually worked?
On the side of success, it absolutely succeeded in cultivating the Hitler myth. It elevated his persona above the gritty reality of daily politics, framing him as an almost infallible, messianic leader.
Right. And it also effectively strengthened the regime's grip during the turbulent economic and political crises between 1929 and 1933.
Yes, and it deeply reinforced established German nationalism and traditional family values.
But the areas where it failed are fascinating to me because they really show the limits of psychological manipulation. The sources emphasize that Goebbels entirely failed in his efforts to denounce and marginalize the Christian churches.
Yeah, the population simply refused to let go of their faith.
And it also failed to completely seduce the working classes away from their established socioeconomic identities.
Right.
The Nazi ideology heavily promoted this concept of the Volksgemeinschaft.
Right.
Actually, let's unpack that term because the sources mention it frequently.
Yeah, Volksgemeinschaft translates roughly to the national community or people's community.
Yeah.
The propagandistic goal was to convince citizens that their primary identity was purely German, transcending any class divisions. They wanted a factory worker and a wealthy industrialist to view themselves as equal comrades in the state.
But oral histories reveal that despite the endless posters and radio broadcasts promoting this unified utopia, a factory worker still felt very much like a marginalized factory worker.
Exactly. The propaganda could not erase their lived reality or their deeply ingrained class solidarity.
And despite banning jazz and burning thousands of books, the regime failed to create a genuinely distinctive, lasting Nazi culture that resonated with the public.
Right.
So, looking at where it succeeded versus where it failed, a pretty clear pattern emerges. Why did the propaganda work so well at building up nationalism, but completely shatter when it tried to tackle religion or class identity?
If we connect this to the bigger picture, it reveals the fundamental nature of mass persuasion. Propaganda functions as an amplifier, not an eraser.
An amplifier, not an eraser.
Yeah. When Goebbels targeted existing cultural currents, like underlying nationalism, historical grievances, or economic anxiety,
Yeah.
the propaganda acted as a massive megaphone.
It amplified those feelings into fanatical support.
Right. But when the machine attempted to completely overwrite a person's deeply held core personal identity, such as their religious faith or their day-to-day class struggles, it failed.
Because you cannot easily broadcast away someone's core identity.
Exactly.
So, if the terror of the Gestapo was the real glue holding the Third Reich together, was Goebbels' entire propaganda machine basically just an incredibly expensive facade?
It's a great point.
Like, was it designed more to make the regime feel legitimate to itself rather than actually convincing the public? Especially if people were getting bored enough to hide from newsreels and cinema lobbies.
The sources basically conclude that the propaganda apparatus was actually of secondary importance compared to the sheer terrifying power of the SS and the police system. The psychological conditioning was the preferred method of control, but it was totally insufficient on its own. Where the invisible rewiring failed, the physical terror of the Gestapo was required to fill the massive, gaping holes in the regime's control.
Analyzing the mechanics of this, seeing the sheer amount of energy and state violence required to monopolize a nation's media, eliminate diverse viewpoints, and pump a single curated narrative through a piece of restricted technology sitting in a family's living room, it is a really heavy thing to process.
It really is.
It just highlights the incredible lengths a state must go to in order to suppress independent thought, and it reminds us of the vital importance of media literacy in protecting independent journalism today.
Absolutely. And taking all of those historical mechanics into account, there is a final, rather unsettling question to mull over regarding our own modern relationship with information.
Oh, what's that?
Well, we have just explored how a totalitarian state utilized heavily subsidized state-issued radios to force a single inescapable message into the private homes of its citizens.
Right.
They had to threaten people with death to prevent them from tuning into foreign stations, just to maintain the illusion of their manufactured reality.
Yeah.
But what happens when the propaganda isn't being forced upon a population by a dictator?
Hmm.
What happens when the echo chamber is a device we voluntarily purchase and carry around in our own pockets?
Yeah. Wow.
When our information feeds are powered by unseen algorithms that perfectly tailor the news to validate our own pre-existing biases, serving us only the narratives we already want to hear.
That is terrifying.
If Joseph Goebbels were alive today, studying how we voluntarily consume information, would he even need to ban the foreign stations? Or would we simply block them out ourselves?
That is a phenomenal question to walk away with. Thank you for spending time with us on this deep dive. Keep questioning the algorithms, keep interrogating the information you consume, and we will catch you on the next one.